Hello everyone, this is Ernst Roots from Lex Libertas. In this video we look into part 4 of our report, Unmasking the Bully Within, the Persecution of Minorities by South Africa's ruling elite. Part 4 deals with the confiscation of private property. Now let me state it clearly from the get-go. This is not just about land. It's about how the political elite in South Africa uses vague laws, reckless threats, and failed ideologies to strip minorities of their rights, security, and future. So let's unpack it. Much of what we understand under the banner of expropriation without compensation, which means nothing else than government confiscation of property, was kicked off in February 2018. When Parliament moved to amend Section 25 of the Constitution, which of course is the Property Rights Clause, to empower the state to expropriate private property without compensation. Now, this sparked massive outrage at home and abroad, with fears of wrecked property rights, economic crash, lost investments, and echoes of Zimbabwe's disaster, which we know all too well because it happened just across the border. The elites, however, doubled down, denouncing criticisms as resistance to transformation. The process to change the Constitution was a mess, with dodgy, deliberately one-sided consultations, submissions against the motion thrown out, constitutional violations regarding procedural matters, and so forth. Progressive critics said that no amendment of the Constitution is needed because the solution is simple. They need only to interpret the Constitution in such a way that it suits their narrative. In other words, property can be confiscated without compensation, even though the Constitution says that compensation must be fair, because to their minds, zero compensation is fair. The process to change the Constitution failed, however, in 2021, lacking 2/3 support. Now, why did it fail? This is important because people seem to have forgotten what happened with the failure of the motion to change the Constitution. It failed because the EFF rejected the constitutional change, depicting it as too weak. They wanted full state control of land, blanket taking of property, and so forth. So the ANC's attempt to soften the language to appease their critics led to internal disagreement and infighting. And so, astonishingly, the attempt to change the Constitution to empower the state to confiscate property failed because the idea was regarded as too weak, because it wasn't aggressive enough. Julius Malema called it a setback for the struggles of black people. And so the political elite pivoted to the Expropriation Act, a piece of legislation introduced in 2020, founded on the notion that expropriation can indeed happen without compensation if only they were to interpret the Constitution in a manner that justifies their ideological predisposition. This act was passed in 2022 and signed by President Ramaphosa in 2025. It repeals the old 1975 Act and greenlights what they call nil compensation. Now, this is also remarkable. Defenders of the Act passionately argue that there will be no such thing as no compensation when they expropriate property under this, because the Act makes it very clear that there will always be compensation, but, and here's the catch, compensation can be nil. And so they honestly and unironically try to convince us that nil compensation is not without compensation, because nil is a number, and without implies that there is no number. And so that is the type of nonsense that we have to put up when it comes to political debate in South Africa. And it's not just ANC politicians arguing this, it's academics and journalists. Now we need to talk about restitution versus redistribution, because in South Africa these terms are generally used as synonyms. This is because they get muddled on purpose, hiding the persecution. So what's the difference? Restitution is by definition aimed at correcting a specific injustice. Now in this context, returning land that was dispossessed as a result of government legislation a century ago. Redistribution in this context is something completely else. It's state-forced, race-based ownership shifts. It's saying that land must be taken from white people, regardless of how they acquired it, and given to black people. It's looking at statistics and concluding that the percentage of land that is owned by white people is too high, and the government has to intervene forcefully if needs be. This shifts brands all white-owned property as stolen or illegitimate by definition, no matter how it was acquired. It's not justice, it's not about correcting historical injustices, it's racial targeting. They do this because there was indeed an extensive restitution process regarding land in South Africa, but one that didn't reach the outcomes that they thought it would, for reasons that are very important. And this was primarily the program of land claims. The land claims process was opened in 1995. It's particularly important to talk about this because it dispels the widely held belief that there is a massive hunger for agricultural or rural land in South Africa, a trope that the president and the political elites repeat ad nauseum. Claimants needed to prove that their historical loss was from discrimination and show that they got no fair compensation back then. It involved lodging with the Commission on Restitution of Land Rights, validating the claim, gazetting it for public notice, negotiating with the current owners and the state, and going to court if there's a problem. About 79,700 claims came in initially, representing millions through community groups. The process reopened from 2014 to 2019, adding over 163,000 more for a total of 242,700. Now fast forward to 2024. Only 83,348 of these claims were settled. That is a dismal 34%. The backlog is staggering, with over 5,700 old claims and thousands from the reopened period still unresolved. The whole thing has been painfully slow, plagued by corruption, and squandered 52 billion South African rands. But here's the kicker. Up to 80% of claims were filed in urban areas, not farms, not rural areas. And 90% of claimants have made it clear that they prefer cash over land. They're choosing money for urban opportunities, not for rural farming life. This has become such a headache for the political elite that many of them have lashed out against land claimants for not wanting land, because they want the people to want land so that they can use it as a justification for the confiscation of land. They seek to persecute minorities, but the methods they employ are not supported by the people they claim to represent. For example, during his 2017 State of the Nation address, former President Jacob Zuma essentially begged claimants to take land instead, claiming that preferring money perpetuates dispossession. It's quite remarkable. The elite is forcing a radical agenda the people reject and then reprimands them for rejecting it. This, of course, marginalizes rural communities, sustaining pressure on white farmers through endless uncertainty. Remarkable, isn't it? The elite pushes a radical agenda the people don't even want, and then scolds them for choosing otherwise. It is quite remarkable, isn't it? So let me state it once again clearly. The elite is pushing a radical agenda that the people don't even want, and then scolds them for choosing otherwise. Now let's do a quick legal breakdown, which is just as important. The Act defines expropriation as state seizure for public purpose, with compensation deemed as just and equitable. But it's all vague and subjective, and deliberately so, because vague definitions leave room for abuse, as I have pointed out already. Also, crucially, property isn't limited to land. It covers movable property, intellectual property, and rights. Null compensation is said to kick in for things like abandoned land, state investments outweighing value, or safety risks. And the defenders of the political elite have been very quick to attack their critics by claiming that expropriation would be done responsibly because look at all these preconditions. But there is a catch. All of those flowery preconditions are preceded with a claim that various factors should be taken into account, including the following. So, including, the word including makes the list open-ended, a non-exhaustive list. Now, many institutions, including the IRR, have warned that this invites wild abuse beyond examples, because the state can simply consider other variables and not those mentioned in the Act. The Free Market Foundation calls it unconstitutional confiscation that guts property rights. Sure, it claims that arbitrary taking is not good and requires court oversight, but ambiguity overrides the safeguards. The text is vague enough to provide ammunition for those who seek to discredit critics of the so-called progressive government, while leaving enough room for destructive abuse through progressive interpretation of the text. It blurs restitution and redistribution, enabling targeted hits on minorities, and ultimately, it forfeits the very basic principles of constitutionalism and what it means to be a democracy, handing power to a corrupt elite to persecute minorities under the banner of flowery language like justice and fairness. Now let's talk about some reckless remarks. The political elite in South Africa fuels fear with reckless and inflammatory talk. President Ramaphosa himself claimed that confiscation of private property would turn South Africa into the Garden of Eden and the ultimate paradise, painting it as a utopian solution while downplaying the risks of economic collapse. Former Deputy President David Mabuza warned that if white farmers didn't voluntarily hand over their land, there would be a violent takeover, positioning minority cooperation with destructive discriminatory legislation as the only way to avoid bloodshed. Zweli Mkhize, as ANC Treasurer General, explicitly stated that expropriation would not target black-owned property, clearly stating a racial focus on white assets that reinforces divisive, racist land reform. Ronald Lamola, the current Minister of International Cooperation, but formerly President of the ANC Youth League, threatened that the safety of white landowners could no longer be guaranteed if they didn't hand over their property. ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula spoke of radical redistribution, causing white people running in their numbers to the United States, turning the country into a rubble like Zimbabwe, while daring US sanctions and vowing not to beg imperialists to preserve sovereignty. These statements echo Robert Mugabe's infamous declaration of no mercy for white people regarding the land, which preceded Zimbabwe's economic ruin, and they create a climate of intimidation that disproportionately targets minorities. And so this brings me to the veneration of minority persecutors and destructive land policies. The political elite in South Africa routinely hero worships oppressive regimes and their destructive policies as models for South Africa. Just the other day, President Ramaphosa himself praised Zimbabwe's ambitious land reforms despite the fact that the country was completely destroyed as a result of these policies. The ANC idolizes Cuba's collectivization for its so-called pursuit of equity and anti-imperialism, and regard Fidel Castro and Che Guevara as heroes worth emulating, not to mention Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. They venerate Soviet socialism, of course having trained thousands of cadres there and viewing it as a reliable ally in liberation struggles. China's state land control is hailed as a blueprint for rapid development and rural revitalization, with leaders like Lamola calling it inspirational for equitable land use. The EFF's Julius Malema pushes for Zimbabwe-inspired radicals, slamming the Expropriation Act as too weak and admiring Mugabe's approach despite its abuses. Despite the famines, the poverty, the human rights violations, in all of these models, the elite seek to normalize these measures, risking South Africa's slide into similar ruin and heightening fears for minorities under such ideologies. So what are the broader implications of all of this? The Act's ambiguities, combined with this reckless rhetoric and veneration of failed idols, perpetuate the persecution of minorities by undermining property rights, sparking dispossession, and driving immigration and instability. It erodes the rule of law, invites international sanctions, and deepens poverty for everyone. This is not redress. It's a tyranny by a political elite so committed to ideological utopia that they have become disconnected from reality. And if we were to consider this method within the context of other factors mentioned in this report, it raises serious concerns about ethnic cleansing in South Africa. This is part 4 in a series of 10. Once we have published each of the 10 sections, we will combine them into a comprehensive report, which will be presented to Parliament, the President, and multiple international bodies. If these matters are not addressed, there would be no other moral solution than to empower minority communities that are at the mercy of a political elite that actively threatens and works to confiscate their property with self-governance. If you support this initiative, I strongly encourage you to sign up as a contributor to Lex Libertas, because doing so enables us to strengthen our team and to upscale our work.